Welcome to The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
Well, Jeremy, while the whole world focuses on, in terms of, I guess, foreign policy or policies related to other nations, I guess the big news is either Trump's repudiation of the post-World War II global order, so to speak, with his repudiation of Canada and our great European allies on economic matters, and also and you can fall into either camp on that. You can fall into the camp of whether this is a great thing or whether this is a bad thing, or you could try to take a more nuanced approach and think that there may be some positives and some negatives, both positives and negatives to this thing. And there's also, of course, the summit heard around the world, with the handshake heard around the world with Trump and Kim Jong-un and all the media circus that's come out of that and the various talking points which have resulted from that. But I think with the Korea thing, what's very interesting is that I get the impression increasingly that a big part of what's going on with Korea is that there's a push by various people that are close to Donald Trump, that have his ear on foreign policy issues related to foreign policy, who want to focus their attention on Iran and on the Middle East rather than the Koreas. And I do think in a way that establishing Trump as someone who can, I think that in a lot of ways, I think the meetings going on in Singapore right now, which has been directly said, I think, by Netanyahu himself, who has commended Trump on the Singapore summit and hopes it will send a message, or hopes that Iran is watching and learning from it. I believe that was what that was something he said in regards to this. I think that there are people who see this, the negotiations with North Korea, as a way to perhaps shift attention and put the Korea thing on the back burner while we focus on Middle East and on Iran. And what we're going to lay out here in a few minutes seems to be a grand alliance between Israel, U.S., and some of these Saudi Arabia and some of these Middle Eastern Gulf kingdoms against Iran. And I think that the relations with the Palestinians plays a major role in what's going on here as well. But I think that there is a belief among people that this Korea thing almost gives a sense of maybe credibility or a sense of legitimacy when it comes to the Iran thing, even though with North Korea, as we're going to lay out here, what is being proposed for Iran, I think the attitudes are incredibly very opposite. But I guess we'll start out by, before we get into these articles, we're going to discuss that while it's important what's going on in Korea, what's important, the relationships with the breakdown of the liberal world order, as Robert Kagan refers to it in a recent article of his, that Trump is basically, he's super speeding up this process with his belligerency and his carelessness for dealing with standard foreign policy protocols. I do think it's important to keep our eyes on this region, what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on with Iran, which seems to have taken the back burner after the dismantling of the nuclear deal and the move of the embassy and all these issues. And of course, I do think that a lot of what's going on with the breakdown of this liberal world order has a lot to do with policy in the Middle East as it relates directly to Iran. Jeremy, what say you?
Well, it was very interesting that the first things I heard out of Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo's mouth right after the handshake and the Singapore conference, Singapore summit, was an immediate redirect of attention to Iran and Venezuela, and about how there was, that these were the serious places that needed some focus. So it's the same old drumbeat. I mean, these are the kind of strain in aspects of the Trump administration foreign policy that we've been tracking for well over a year, both in terms of this focus and aggression towards Venezuela. That's nothing new in the Washington consensus. So that's not new. And then this Iran stance, there is something a little bit new to that, it looks like, in terms of a more aggressive approach towards Iran that is most obviously displayed by these kind of people, the Boltons, the Pompeos. But at the very least, this movement and turn towards some amount of rapprochement in the Korean Peninsula needs to be recognized at the very least, that the Koreans, at the very least, North and South, there seems to be a lot of smiling faces. And that just in the midst of this idea of beginning to de-escalate tensions, military-type tensions in the region, that seems to be a good thing for peoples on the ground. The larger geopolitics of that, though, I think are much more complicated, and we haven't yet seen where all of this goes, but there is a very strong economic integrationist perspective, I think, that's being hinted at in terms of this Singapore summit. And it was even talked about how that in the North Korean film of the summit, there was a lot of emphasis on the shiny, well-lit, highly modern streets of Singapore that you would almost never have seen before in North Korean internal documentary propaganda film, this type of scenario. And so that does seem to indicate that there. And maybe it's related to this Iran deal from the Obama administration, that there's this sort of global economic integrationist movement and momentum being created, where there's a combination of a carrot and a stick, and the carrot is the riches that will come to a nation, or at least the elite of a nation, when they are more fully integrated into this economic world order. But one thing is that just sort of looking back at this whole TPP scenario and Trump's opposition to the TPP, it was seen as just a sort of a nationalist emanation of his antagonism to the NAFTA agreement, and to potentially work out a more pro-nationalist trade policy. But I think there's other ways of interpreting it, and especially in terms of this real deep relationship with China, I think. And even hearkening back to this Steele dossier, that you either have as sort of like some type of new Bible for the liberal establishment in Washington, D.C., or sort of called garbage, or just a big nothing burger, or complete fake intelligence by both aspects of the left, and also then, of course, some of the Trump supporters on the right, is that the Steele dossier pointed out that even some of the emphasis around the Russia connection could even be potentially being cultivated by aspects of the Trump campaign at that point on purpose, in order to distract from much more damning and much deeper ties to China and other countries, it said. So people should go look at that, and I would say that, yes, okay, so as you have the Belt Road Initiative, beginning to build momentum and traction, and China is the major driver all throughout, the Pacific region and down into the Southeast Asia, but all the way across Eurasia, that there's probably a sense of like that the United States involvement in the TPP, beyond all the problems of globalization in terms of an economic so-called philosophy, and the undermining of people's sovereignty, dignity, economic nationalism, economic indigenous movements, being able to have a hierarchy of needs being built from the roots up in countries, rather than just to initiate a race to the bottom in terms of wages, or in terms of things like ecological preservation and rejuvenation. Instead, this globalization philosophy basically created a race to the bottom of all of those types of things that the economy is supposed to serve we the people, not just in terms of sort of cheap consumer goods to the middle class in the U.S., but real economic rejuvenation from the bottom up, I think, is what we, the people of the country, and we, the people of the world, really desire. So putting that whole critique of globalization aside, part of what was potentially at stake with the TPP was this what was being called the pivot to Asia, right, during the Obama administration sort of second half. And part of that was that the United States was going to be a player in relationship to some of this economic integration throughout Asia, and that it wouldn't only be a sort of a China-driven thing. And so more and more, I do see aspects of this policy, this Trump policy in relationship specifically to Asia and China, as really in a certain way sort of putting China once again front and center in a way, and to really have there be no other counterpoint for Asian countries to balance. And so it becomes, in the midst of this multipolar shift, what we really begin to see is an increasing establishment of unipolar regions in a way, and that, who knows, that may be some type of agreed upon thing at the highest levels across, if you move from west to east across the planet, is yes, the U.S. of the post 9/11 era of ruling the entire planet from the swamps of D.C. is the plug has been pulled on that, but at the same time there's going to be a recommitment to a multipolar power, but each pole in that multipolar world then runs its own region in a very top-down, strong fashion. And so I do think that is partially what's potentially implied by some of the things that are going on in relationship to this North Korea summit of Trump's, but also the longer-term policy towards China and the Far East. So that's that aspect. So we should keep an eye on that thing going on. But meanwhile, it's very clear that the intense focus in terms of so-called foreign policy of the Trump administration and the closest ties have been to the Middle East, and then what certain players in the Middle East, most obviously Israel, but also the UAE and Saudi Arabia, what their stance is towards Iran. So I guess that I think we do need to focus on, because there's also this Trita Parsi article that we become aware of very recently that makes a pretty good case. Its title is "Iran is not North Korea. Trump's regional allies prefer civil war to peace. Unlike with Pyongyang, America's allies in the region are not interested in a diplomatic solution to the Iran issue," which sort of proposes that, in the way I'm seeing it, is that the Syria option, not the Libya option, but the Syria option, is really what's potentially on the table in regards to Iran. And so this clarifies some matters that we've been struggling with understanding, I would say, for the last year.
Yeah, I agree. And this Trita Parsi article lays out, I would say, a very valid and a very, I think, a very strong case for this possibility. And it's something that's not discussed when you hear all the time about maybe sucking Iran dry with sanctions, or you hear about just outright military option, regime change, which seems to be a go-to line for many of Trump's critics, as far as you'll hear, oh, well, John Bolton's coming in, so that means that Trump is preparing to get the U.S. into a war with Iran or a military conflict. And I am increasingly not seeing that as being the case. And when you think about this Iran thing, and I do think that there is a desire, because what was the big staple of Trump's campaign promise? Say what you want about Trump and so many of the negatives, but whatever Cambridge Analytica inspired talking points Trump had, one of the big ones that resonated the most, I think, with a lot of people was this whole idea of this we're not getting involved in military conflicts, in trying to decrease U.S. military involvement in actions worldwide, and taking a less hostile approach towards the world. And a lot of people call it America First. Maybe, some people might mistakenly call it non-interventionist, because I don't believe that we're getting non-interventionism under Trump. But certainly the whole concept of America First, and we're going to put America first. We're not going to be involved in all of these, not only entangling alliances such as some of these European alliances, which have made up the post World War II liberal world order, as Robert Kagan and so many others refer to it to, but also a turn back from the Bush doctrine of what made up the war on terror, and things such as the Iraq blunder and all this. That was appealed to so many people, and I got to say, it appealed in large part to me, because that's one of the things that made me, for quite a long period of time, basically not so much support Trump, but support this idea of the lesser evil in the election as opposed to Hillary Clinton. It was almost, as we described, it was like the enemy you knew compared to the enemy you didn't know. That's how I would put it. But Trump, there was so much there, and there was so much optimism from people because of the rhetoric and things that we're saying. But in midst of all that, Trump has always had this hardline stance against Iran. That was what inspired him to run for president. He said he was inspired by the Iran deal, the worst deal ever. And Trump spoke at that September 2015 anti-Iran nuclear deal rally, which was held in D.C. I think Ted Cruz and Sarah Palin were there, and a bunch of other anti-Iran hardliners. So there's always been that hardline there. And it's certainly taken root in Trump's administration, particularly once people like once people like Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster were out the door, and that allowed Trump to rip up this Iran deal. And in the process of this whole concept, is Trump going to declare war on Iran? Is John Bolton going to start raining down bombs on Tehran? There are other possibilities that are being left out of this. I mean, I've thought about the possibility of perhaps, instead of a full-blown military conflict, which I think a large portion of Trump's base does not want. I think people are wary of these foreign conflicts and do not want any part of that, even with the very successful workings on behalf of people affiliated with close to Trump to turn to create even increase and the ire and the disdain towards Arab Muslim populations under Trump and people in the Trump movement. I do think there is still this hostility to another foreign conflict taking place, and I think that people want to avoid that. So there have to be other options on the table, perhaps, for dealing with a country such as Iran, which Trump and those behind him obviously are not satisfied with maintaining, as far as the something such as an Iran deal, and actually want to really take a hardline stance. It could result in something like a regime change, or at the very least a rolling back of Iran's capabilities in the Middle East as a threat to an Israel. And one of those that has to be taken into consideration is the possibility of a civil war and creating domestic strife in Iran. And I think we've speculated that something such as some of these organizations, these private armies that people like Eric Prince are putting out, and perhaps this deal making between Eric Prince and UAE advocates, people such as this George Nader and also this Joel Zamel and the Australian-Israeli behind Psy Group. Perhaps a large part of these dealings is to create these this alliance has taken place between Israel and Saudi Arabia and these Arab kingdoms. Perhaps part of that is setting up private type armies, Blackwater type armies, to create and to maintain domestic turmoil and strife. I know Trita Parsi raised the possibility of the Mujahideen al-Khalq, the MEK, being used in this regard, as you have a lot of people in Trump's inner circle that are supporters of the MEK. So we have to take this into consideration. And while people want to focus on the military option, there are other options on the table. And I would say that one of the strongest possibilities would be you could create a Syria type scenario. That way, goals get matched and reached, while in the process you don't have to start another major military conflict that will only turn a large part of Trump's base against him.
Yeah, and understanding this again comes with some problem of large portions of the anti-imperial, both across the entire spectrum, but really also a lot in the left, not really understanding the purpose of this Syria operation, and because then that makes it more difficult to actually see that there's all kinds of different possibilities between regime change and no regime change. And so this is definitely, we've been tracking this. There's always been this hint in the background with Iran of the sowing of discord and this idea of destabilization or rolling back that elements of Israel and the sort of hardline neoconservatives from the U.S. had been talking about in relationship to some of Israel's neighbors since at least the 90s, if not much earlier in terms of Oded Yanon. So this is a well-known strategy beyond regime change, and I think maybe it's our U.S. Background that makes us think mainly about things like regime change, because that's the history that we know so well in relationship to the CIA, is just coups and using destabilization in order to do a coup and to change the actual leadership, whether that the sort of infamous Iran operation of 53, Ajax, the usage of paid-for crowds, counter gangs, but in order to overthrow Mossadegh and put in the Shah. And then we also, that whole history is very, very well known, including the very next year in Guatemala and overthrowing of Arbenz, basically on behalf of fruit companies. So there's a sort of interface of the corporate U.S. agenda with the regime change operation that utilizes counter gangs and destabilization. But this more Israeli-centric model, where it's actually about undermining or rolling back, in the words of the Clean Break paper, that is really at the forefront now. But of course, there was the Iraq and Libya, right, where there was an overthrow of the leadership. So that has to be thrown in the mix too. But then, casting back a few months to the Iranian protests that we did a little bit of coverage of, there was the sense at the time that this was a dry run in many ways, or a potential to spark that kind of civil war type scenario that's now being more openly considered in the press now. And so I think that we do need to stay focused on that and to try to move that kind of education around in the media sphere, so people can get beyond this whole thing of Russia stopped Israel's program in Syria to overthrow Assad.
Yes, I agree. And sorry about that. I just had a brain fart there for a second. Hello?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Anyway, yeah, I agree with you. And while also, I think it's interesting when you mention how we affiliate things, associate things with regime change, right? Whether it's the CIA, whether it's the history of the regime change efforts that we know about, basically where the Cold War was used as an excuse for all this covert, in a few cases overt, but mostly covert. If you look at Iran, that was a very covert operation in terms of Operation Ajax and the process, how that played out. The Cold War being used as an excuse to just go in and overtly, and in many cases covertly, overthrow governments that were seen as a threat to perhaps the post-World War II agenda of global hegemony centered out of Washington, D.C. In a lot of ways, there are some similarities to a model like this with Iran. If this is indeed something that could be put in place, and that it would be largely covert. And I got to say, wouldn't it be ironic if, Trump and people make such noise about arming ISIS, but it would be ironic if you had these private covert mercenary armies in Iran stoking up turmoil that we were supporting. There would be some irony to that, but there are some similarities in that whole thing too. So it's not quite as different as a lot of people would like to make it out to be, but there are some basic and important differences in terms of the actual policy of regime change and something like what is being posed here by Trita Parsi, which I think is extremely valid and something that should be taken very strongly into consideration for a number of reasons as we've laid out. Did you want to comment before we get into this New Yorker article?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just read a little bit from the middle of the article. And of course, Parsi is coming from this sort of establishment perspective of the need for some. I mean, he was of course behind the Iran deal and the reintegration of Iran into the global economy, but he really makes some key points here in terms of what certain players here, what their interests are, and specifically certain players within Israel and Saudi Arabia. So in the middle of the article, there's a section called "A More Potential Rival." If Iran had a proper democracy that respected the rights of the Iranian people and provided them with the freedom to realize their full potential, Iran's power in the region would arguably rise well beyond what it has so far achieved through taking advantage of America's regional missteps. Such an Iran would be a far more potent rival to Saudi Arabia, a scenario Riyadh hardly wants to help bring about. Instead, the pursuit of regime change may in reality be an avenue to achieve a far more sinister objective, a civil war in Iran that could either lead to Iran's dismemberment or at a minimum a prolonged state of debilitating instability. While democratization in Iran would not shift the regional balance in Saudi Arabia's favor, turning Iran into Syria would. This may also explain Saudi Arabia's support for the MEK terrorist group. Riyadh surely understands that the MEK has no support inside Iran and that the prospects of it taking power in Iran is close to nil. From that perspective, Riyadh's investment in the MEK makes no sense. But the MEK can help spark an internal conflict in Iran, and from that vantage point, Riyadh's investment in the terror group could serve a purpose. And then finally, Saudi Arabia may not be alone in viewing the promotion of instability in Iran as a path to shift the balance of power against Iran. Senior Israeli Mossad official Chaim Tomer recently told the Jerusalem Post that Israel can and should promote regime change in Iran because, quote, even if regime change does not succeed, it is better to have the Iranians fighting amongst themselves, unquote. This would not be the first time Iran's regional rivals would seek instability in Iran or the dismemberment of the country. During the Iraq-Iran war, Saddam Hussein's foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, famously lamented Iraq's geopolitical dilemma being situated next to the much larger and more powerful Iran. Quote, it is better to have 5 Irans, 5 small Irans, rather than one big Iran, unquote, he told the Washington Post in 1981 as he spelled out Saddam's goal of dismembering Iran as recounted to David Ottaway. And then this is the last paragraph. This may not be where Trump aims to go, but unlike with North Korea, disregarding the pressures and designs of America's allies in the region will likely prove far more difficult on Iran.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what this lays out is this is a brand new scenario that needs to be taken very, very, very seriously here. And so anyway, in terms of this, I think that this is a great segue into this article because you mentioned in this article it talks about Saudi Arabia's direct role in its hostility to Iran and long-fledged rivalry, which I think is really, is one of the major, maybe the main factor in this this shift from Saudi Arabia out of this more what Robert Kagan refers to as the liberal world order centered out of the West via Washington, D.C., and into a more closer alliance with Israel, an open alliance with Israel and I think in the more hardline factions of Zionism. In this New Yorker article, which I think was just tremendous, written by Adam Entis is the name. I believe that's how he pronounces his name. And I know that the New Yorker is probably the bastion of liberal establishment thinking, as far as, the what you'd see out of the New Yorker, I think represents the liberal Western establishment mindset as much as any other publication does. But I will say between this article and I'd say Ronan Farrow's articles on Black Cube and shedding light on its machinations related both to Harvey Weinstein and also the Trump administration in terms of digging up dirt on opponents of the Iran deal, I'd say it's been some pretty quality journalism out of the New Yorker. And as recently in recent months. And this article sheds a lot of light, among other things, on the evolution of the relationship, particularly of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in relationship to Israel, and the shift, you could say, particularly in Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, which really, I think, kicked into high gear after the death of King Abdullah. And King Abdullah represented the old line, I guess, Saudi establishment, which was in some areas had an alliance with, there was some overlap between Saudi and Israeli policy, but there certainly wasn't I don't think there were good relations. I think that Saudi Arabia was more in line with the Western elite types who came up with things such as the petrodollar, for example, and more or less just the Western, maybe what you'd call, Jeremy, the Atlanticist view of the Middle East, and the policy was done in a way to maintain Western neoliberal hegemony. Now, since the death of Abdullah and the consolidation of power by King Salman and his son MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, I think that this shift from one faction to this Israeli Zionist faction, I think, is pretty much has almost been complete, and it's all but official, as we've seen Salman openly praise Israel, say we've never had a conflict with Israel, we've never had problems with Israel, our enemy is Iran, and the Palestinians should just sit down and shut up and accept whatever Israel gives them. So I think that this is something that has pretty much been, I think, is all but official, this shift, and I think it's very significant. I think that was the key to the recent events in Saudi Arabia, is to understand this shift from the neoliberal Western clique to this more hardline Zionist clique that's centered out of Israel, with obviously has its networks throughout the West, and even in a place such as Russia, perhaps, where Russia and Saudi Arabia have come closer. And there's some details in this article about deals being made between Russia and Saudi Arabia and the UAE as a means of perhaps winning over Russia, trying to win Russia from the Iranian circle of influence, which could figure into the possibility that we've laid out. Not saying this is a fact, but the possibility which needs to be considered that perhaps Russia is serving a role in Syria of keeping Iran out. And so when we look at it from this regard, you could see deal making between Russia and Saudi Arabia and these various Gulf oil monarchies led by the United Arab Emirates as playing into that. But anyway, this article gets into not only the evolution of the Saudi Arabian relationship with Israel, but also the relationship of the UAE, which I don't think is focused on enough. And we've seen the United Arab Emirates pop up as a major factor in the elements of the Mueller investigation as it relates to Israel, as it relates to Russian Israelis, and that whole sphere of his investigation. And so this article does get into a lot of details regarding this history and the real shift in most recent years. There was a very revealing quote from Michael Oren. He was he our ambassador? Was he Israel's ambassador for a while? I forget, but he served an ambassador role.
He was Israel's ambassador. Okay,
Israel's ambassador to the U.S. Had a very, I think, important and very revealing quote that Obama sought to bring the Arabs and Israelis together for peace, but he ended up bringing them together, but by a common hostility to his Iran policy. So Yeah, I think this is very important in terms of the history of the shift and the evolution in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies, in more in line with Israel and on Israel's side. And of course, we saw that. I think a big part of the Trump trip to Saudi Arabia was solidifying this, bringing about and solidifying this alliance, so to speak. And so, and this figures very much into the machinations of this alliance against Iran. What is its end goal? Is it military conflict, or are there other means, more covert means of achieving certain ends for Iran? And so, I think this article is very instructive and lays out a lot of important history that we haven't really heard in a lot of other places. But it does help to connect dots when you look at elements of the Mueller investigation that are focusing on businessmen out of the UAE and relationships with Eric Prince, and also this in Israelis such as Joel Zamel out of the Psy Group, and what role this could play in this whole quote unquote Russiagate investigation. So it's important for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and let me just read a few paragraphs here to sort of give some sense of what the actual content of this article is. So, quote, with Obama finally out of the way, Netanyahu could concentrate on getting the Trump team to embrace his grand strategy for transforming the direction of Middle Eastern politics. His overarching ambition was to diminish the Palestinian cause as a focus of world attention and to form a coalition with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to combat Iran, which had long supported Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza and had taken strategic advantage of the American folly in Iraq and the war in Syria. Obama had not been at all naive about Iran's behavior, but he felt that the nuclear agreement would limit its power. Trying to topple the Iranian regime seemed to Obama dangerously in line with previous adventures in the Middle East, in which dreams of democratic revolution backed by force ended in nightmare. What's more, Obama was wary of efforts by the Saudis, who were hardly champions of democracy and human rights, to pull him deeper into regional conflicts. But the Israelis, the Gulf states, and now Trump believe the opposite, that Iran was the principal enemy in the region and that the nuclear pact showed weakness and only fueled Iranian expansionism. Before the inauguration, Netanyahu had taken the bold step of quietly dispatching Yossi Cohen, the head of Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, to Washington. Cohen briefed Flynn on the Iranian threat in an attempt to ensure that the two governments would be closely aligned in their approach. Intelligence veterans said that Cohen's visit was a breach of protocol. And then finally, Trump did not exactly scour the U.S. diplomatic corps to staff his foreign policy team, and Netanyahu had every reason to believe that the central figures in the new administration had a, quote, special feeling, unquote, for Israel. Trump put Jared Kushner in putative charge of Middle East policy. The choice for ambassador to Israel was David Friedman, a bankruptcy lawyer from Long Island who held right-wing views on the Middle East and contributed money in support of the same West Bank settlement as the Kushners. The chief envoy to the region would be Jason Greenblatt, a graduate of Yeshiva University and an attorney who worked for the Trump Organization. Netanyahu could be confident that Trump would look out for his interests and share his opposition to Obama's policies in the region. Even before Trump entered the White House, Israeli officials talked about having more influence and a freer hand than ever before. Dermer had planned to return to Israel in 2017, but he agreed to remain in place as ambassador to help Netanyahu capitalize on the turn of events. Okay, last paragraph, one more. On Inauguration Day, State Department buses carried members of the diplomatic corps to the Capitol. The ambassadors in attendance had radically different perspectives on the incoming administration. The French ambassador, Gerard Araud, had tweeted after the election, quote, "A world is collapsing before our eyes," vertigo, unquote. The presence of Kislyak took some observers by surprise. One of the European ambassadors at the ceremony said to Kislyak, quote, "You are the most important ambassador here today," unquote. Kislyak smiled and gestured at Ron Dermer. Actually, Kislyak said, quote, "He is the most important ambassador here today," unquote.
Yeah, yeah, and Kislyak, for those who I think most people probably know who Kislyak is the Russian ambassador who has been very much a part of this Russiagate via meetings with, I believe it was Michael Flynn, among others. So that's Sergei Kislyak. So for him to say that Ron Dermer is the most influential ambassador, that I think says quite a bit. And there's also another passage in this article. I think it's funny as it relates to Russiagate, and one of the lines we keep hearing about the Russiagate narrative is that Trump trusts Russia more than he trusts his own national intelligence and national security people that are warning him about Russia's attempts to influence our quote unquote democracy. This article says essentially the same thing, but says it about Israel, that the Trump team trusts Israel over its own intelligence and voices within the intelligence community. So I think that that something like that sheds a lot of light, obviously, but this budding relationship that is built between Israel, the U.S., and the Arab countries is extremely important, and it fits into the title of this article, Trump's New World Order. So whatever we're seeing with Iran and is going to be very much dictated by these countries, and also the evolution of the relationship with Palestinians. Is if you listen to someone like a Mohammed bin Salman, it does appear that perhaps this could end up being the final betrayal knife in the back, so to speak, could come from the Arab countries that at one point were rather uneasily were considered allies of the Palestinian cause. And I laid out, I think, in our conversation with you, the carrot and stick approach, whereas Mohammed bin Salman lays out the carrot to the Saudis, or to the Palestinians, the carrot. Look, do this and come to grips, and if you don't, we're going to lay out the stick, and that basically means we're just going to lay the hammer down on you.
Yes, and I mean, it's also interesting, too, to sort of consider the context of this article in relationship to the article by Robert Kagan, Order from Chaos, Trump's America Does Not Care, from the Brookings, sort of from the home base of the Brookings Institute, and it originally appeared in the Washington Post, that in a certain way, if we were to sort of zoom out and think about this moment in relationship to someone like Alexander Dugin and his political philosophy of the fourth way, right? The fourth what's the way he calls it? The
fourth political theory.
Yes, and so he basically, what he goes through is it's the liberal order, right? And that's sort of the order is seen to have sort of conquered the world in many ways, and
that's the deep state. The deep state, according to the pro-Trump people.
That's associated with the unipolar moment of the neocons in many ways, even though I think that we might want to see some difference here in relationship to what actual kind of liberal orderists the actual neocons, this group of neocons, as we've defined before, as maybe not the Israel First neocons, but the Israel Second neocons, those that did seek American empire from D.C. But then Dugin then talks about that the other two major political movements, especially of the 20th century, were communism and everything associated with that, socialism, Marxism, and then thirdly, fascism and sort of right-wing aspects of all forms of that too, including Mussolini, but Hitler, but also aspects in South America, Peronism, this type of thing. So there's a sense of that we should also understand these interpretations of Donald Trump coming from partisans of this liberal order in a way, as coming from this very specific perspective of where they actually do see a breakdown in the global order, in some type of rupture in relationship to what Trump is doing. And so I think this is important to understand, because it also then you begin to understand sort of what this fourth politics, this is meant to actually be, and how in many ways it can be seen to be of service to the most extreme elements of the aspects of Israeli power, of the neoconservatives, in relationship to this idea of what the multipolar world actually seems to present in many ways. So I just wanted to bring that in because that's sort of underlying some of these perspectives, and maybe in future shows we can go more deeply into that and analyze what Robert Kagan's real beef is with Trump. He basically says something that it's neither an interventionist nor an isolationist approach, but that it's a sort of a me first global individualism of some sort. So it's sort of it's aggressive, it's involved in the world, but there's no self-sacrifice as the neoconservatives of that lot attempt to portray themselves as trying to export the best of the West in terms of quote-unquote democracy to the rest of the world, even though those of us paying attention knew that the more realpolitik aspect of those neoconservatives really was this Israeli expansionism.
Absolutely. And I do think we can revisit it. And I will throw in the caveat with regards to Dugin in this conversation, what we're laying out about Iran. The fact that Alexander Dugin was at this big Iranian event in Tehran, this big conference, the New Horizons conference, and is almost expressing solidarity with Iran, that also I think is something that needs to be taken into consideration and analyzed. And that might be for another time, but that obviously does deserve a lot of analysis in relation to what appears to be going on with regards to Iran and the policy towards it. So, we do need to take that into consideration for sure. And so also in this article here about this Trump's New World Order article in the New Yorker, the second half of the article gets into a couple, I think, of other very important topics and quite interesting, quite revealing topics. I think the biggest thing to come out of the second half of this article was much like it details the evolution of the relationship of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in relation to Israel, it also lays out the evolution of Sheldon Adelson's political backing of Donald Trump. And it goes into just as I call it, the evolution of this relationship, and also mentions Adelson as a significant power broker in Israel is related to Netanyahu and allowing the bringing in of the hardline Netanyahu government after Adelson used his platform as a propaganda machine against Ehud Olmert, the prime minister prior to Netanyahu, who was seen as too conciliatory, I guess, to the Palestinians, not hard enough on them. And so anyway, it gets into this, and it gets into how in the early months of Trump's campaign, he saw Trump as rather erratic and wasn't sure if he wanted to support this guy who's coming out saying all these bad things about Republican and other Republican candidates who Adelson had his eye on, particularly Marco Rubio. And then it gets into Adelson over time, how Adelson came around to Trump. And it seems to be that a key part of this was, although I think Adelson had given some money to Trump in the spring of 2016 once he was the only GOP candidate left standing, this article gets into a major meeting between Sheldon Adelson and Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon. I believe Ron Dermer, the ambassador, I don't know if he was present at this one, but certainly Adelson, Kushner, and Bannon were present at this meeting where Adelson, key support from Sheldon Adelson for Trump was won on the promise that this embassy would be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And Steve Bannon was talking about moving the embassy on the first day, the day of the inauguration, which turned out not to happen, I think in large part because there was a pushback by what some people may call the adults in the room in terms of the foreign policy community, although I just call them just criminals working on behalf of another global gang, so to speak. Your Tillersons and your H.R. McMasters and your James Mattises. But that does lay out in this article how Adelson's support for Trump really kicked into high gear after this embassy pledge was put together. And of course, you have the guy who runs the media outlet that was conceived in Israel, promising to move the embassy on the first day, along with Netanyahu's old friend Jared Kushner, friends with the Kushner family. They're just the primary players in this meeting, of course. And then subsequent meetings took place with Netanyahu, which laid out the vision for Netanyahu's foreign policy vision regarding Iran, and this grand alliance was laid out in a subsequent meeting with Kushner and Bannon and Trump present at Trump Tower. I believe this is when Netanyahu spoke to the United Nations in the fall of 2016. So the evolution of Adelson's support for Trump, and even in this article, it's very interesting how this article lays out the fact that Adelson is a kingmaker within Republican politics, and just flat out says the man, basically paraphrasing, the man eats, sleeps, and breathes Israel. That's his issue. He's, Israeli, much like, Haim Saban on the left. It's just interesting to see New Yorker not come right out and say it, but basically all but exactly say that the basis of one of the two or three primary GOP kingmakers is Israel. That's what he's motivated by. That's what he's driven by. That's what he bases his support or unsupport of a candidate on. And in this, it lays out how Adelson, while you had this veneer of the Never Trump movement and the constantly getting all this attention within the GOP, how the GOP establishment via Adelson was really a large sector of it whose opinions really mattered, were behind Trump. And you could also extend this also to the Mercer family. Remember, it was the Mercer Breitbart Council for National Policy network that essentially took over the Trump campaign and also had that serious infusion of money. And we don't know what motivates the Mercers per se because they're very reclusive. But, obviously Israel's a primary motivator, and Zionism is evidenced by Mercer's bankrolling and funding of Breitbart, which is a website that is conceived out of Israel, as revealed in the Netanyahu-Andrew Breitbart meeting of 2007 that Larry Solov brags about in the article Breitbart Made in America, conceived in Israel. So I think this is important. And the other thing that's laid out in the second half of this article is just the general lack of policy or lack of any type of motivating, guiding ideology of regards to issues related to foreign policy, and how Trump may have this grandiose vision of trying to bring peace to this region. He wants to do that, but also he's just manipulated. He's so easily swayed and manipulated by so many people around him. Like, Trump can start talking about peace, and Netanyahu can show him a video of Palestinian leaders, what he describes as agitating for violence against Israel and against Jews. And of course, you got the hardliners like David Friedman, who doesn't think there's a such thing as a Palestinian people, has compared the liberal Zionist organization J Street to Jews who sided with Germany in World War II, and such other hardliners. Of course, you could even look at Kushner himself. And you can see that while, yes, Trump, you can see this personality conflict. It even lays out in the article something we've talked about, where Netanyahu is kind of wary of Trump because he's concerned that the unpredictable Trump could just turn at the drop of a hat. And we've laid that out. But I think this article also sheds light into Trump's personality and how, he has these grandiose visions of certain things that he may want to actually genuinely accomplish. But at the end of the day, we've established that most likely Trump's bread is buttered by these hardline Zionist elements at the end of the day on a global perspective. And in addition to that, I think he's very easily moved by people in this whole game, so people such as Ron Dermer and I guess also David Friedman, that he's very easily, there was a term that was used for Bush, he's very easily swayed in a lot of ways. So I thought the evolution of the Adelson support for Trump, and also this kind of this insight, I think, credence to what we've talked about in regards to Donald Trump's personality and temperament. I think a lot of light was shed on that in the second half of this article.
Yes, and I think that this issue of Iran being this sort of central focus of a lot of these forces here, including probably the long-term planning of people like Netanyahu in relationship to creating this strategic relationship with the Sunni countries around them in relationship to Iran, needs to also then be considered about why it potentially is so dangerous and have a lot of support deep within the U.S. establishment, because there's an article from the Loeb blog called "Follow the Money." 3 billionaires paved way for Trump's Iran deal withdrawal, and it points out that it of course mentions Sheldon Adelson and that whole background, but then it also talks about Bernard Marcus, the Jewish Zionist billionaire who from Home Depot. But then it also brings in Paul Singer, who's known as the Jewish Zionist billionaire who originally funded the Steele dossier in terms of funding when Singer was against Trump. When I think they were probably promoting someone more like a Marco Rubio. But then it shows the evolution in that by the time it was time for the inauguration, Paul Singer was on board with millions of dollars, and Bernard Marcus was Trump's second biggest donor after Sheldon Adelson, I believe, and how all three of them are tied. Well, definitely Bernard Marcus and Paul Singer hover around this Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, so-called, which of course is the new poll for the paleo neocons. So what we see then in the midst of this is that while you have people like
Jeremy, that's a great point, by the way. I wanted to say this real quick with regards to Paul Singer, because you hear about Paul Singer, he funded the dossier, but you don't hear about any context applied to that, such as what he did maybe after the inauguration when certain promises and certain things were maybe put into place. You don't hear about that. You only hear, he's a Jew who opposed Trump and he funded this dossier. That's all you hear. So you don't hear any context about that. So I'm glad you provided that context with regards to Paul Singer.
Yeah, and so then I think it's important to understand that there's probably a lot of force and backing behind whatever the Iran strategy here is, and it does not look good. So I think we need to stay focused on that and try to also break down this absurd scenario that these neocons are somehow against Trump in some way when it comes down to the realpolitik of things like Iran and the deep desires of the Netanyahu gang. And then finally, I just wanted to then go back to the final small little paragraph of the New Yorker article, Donald Trump's New World Order, and it says, quote, "The Palestinians seem to be the likely losers in the new Middle East." As a senior Arab official said of the strategic alliance, quote, "With or without a peace plan, it's happening," unquote. A senior Trump advisor said, quote, "Iran is the reason why this is all happening," unquote. Oh, and very interestingly, last thing, and we only have about 30 seconds to a minute left. It says that the article originally appeared in the print edition of the New Yorker with the headline, "The Enemy of My Enemy." So, Greg, any final thoughts quickly?
No, I just think, just that we just need to continue to take these considerations into interest in regards to the Robert Kagan wing. And I don't even know if Kagan even likes the term neocon. He calls himself a liberal interventionist. That's his official title he likes to describe himself as. It's not opposition to Trump based out of some type of, Trump has principles that's going to destroy this world order. No, I think it comes down to which faction of this whole global factions that are fighting for control, which side he ultimately really comes down on. That and a combination of the unpredictability factor, I think, is what is driving this opposition from this Never Trump faction of the neoconservative movement, not some type of like Trump having a principled, morally based foreign policy that's going to just destroy their agenda.
Yeah, so let's look some more into that in terms of this liberal order, liberal global consensus that sort of now exposed the neocons and the neoliberals as a very intimate political partners, as we've already known. But until next week, Antidote, we out.
All right, see you next time.